Yeah.
Like the things they're protesting. Yeah. It's like you have a problem.
people could take their seats, we're going to wait a couple more minutes for some more people to filter in, and then we'll get started. And those of you on the Zoom audience, hang on, we're going to be broadcasting. All right, so you're here, Anya. Oh, no, I'm sorry, one more. Okay, got it. Okay, everybody. Welcome to FSI and to our celebration today. My name is Frank Fukuyama. I'm a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute. And since 2019, I've had the honor to be the director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 2024 community convening of the MIP program. We had our 40th anniversary last year, and we are happy to welcome back people who have been associated with the program, alums and others, to this event. Susan Ford Dorsey and her husband, unfortunately, are not able to join us, but we want to recognize the contribution they've made to our program, the support that they've given us over the years, and many students that benefited individually from that. So we are going to talk about artificial intelligence. That may be surprising that we should pick this topic at this particular moment because nobody else is talking about it, but we do have some real expertise here at Stanford. I think that anyone that has played around with ChatGPT for a few minutes realizes that this is really going to be a much bigger deal. In my humble opinion, not every technological innovation has had that status, like crypto, which I believe from the beginning was always a bit of a Ponzi scheme. But this thing, I think the developments in AI are the real thing, and they are going to be very transformative. And I think that we've got a series of panelists that can talk about what that transformation may look like and how societies are going to deal with it in their respective areas. So let me introduce the speakers for today. Anya Manuel is the co-founder and partner of Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel, which is a strategic consulting firm that helps U.S. companies navigate the international situation. She's also the executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum, an affiliate of CSAC, and of course, most importantly, a graduate of the MIP program, which back in her day in 1996, when she graduated, was known as International Policy Studies. And taught in the program. Yes,
great.
yes.
So happy to be here.
So she's, it's great to have her back again. Dr. Jared Dunman is Senior Advisor to the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Defense Innovation Unit, where he was Technical Director for Artificial Intelligence from 2020 to 2023. He's also Vice President of Future Technologies at Our Next Energy and an affiliate of CSAC. His research focuses on developing weakly supervised machine learning systems to support applications in areas such as medicine, energy, and the environment and intelligence analysis. Next, we will have Dr. David Lobel, Professor David Lobel. He's the Benjamin Page Professor at Stanford in the Department of Earth Sciences, Earth System Sciences, and Gloria and Richard Kuchel, Director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment here at FSI, where he's also a senior fellow. He's also a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment and has worked on agriculture and food security, developing new techniques to measure progress in sustainable development goals and studying the impacts of climate-smart practices in agriculture. Last but not least is Nate Persily. He's the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at the Stanford Law School with appointments in political science and communications as well, and a senior fellow at FSI. He's co-director of the Cyber Policy Center upstairs, the Stanford Program on Democracy and the Internet, and Social Science One, which was an attempt to make data coming from the platforms more available to academics who wanted to study it. Of course, he's had a prior career in electoral administration, where he's been a special master in redistricting, and so he's deep into the weeds on questions of American democracy. So we'll have each of the speakers talk for about 5 or so minutes about how AI is impacting the issues that they are looking at. Then we'll have a discussion and open it up to comments and questions, including those that are following this online. So Anya, why don't you begin?
Great. Thank you so much, Frank, for having me. And it's so great to see some familiar faces and to be back at MIP. It's just a fantastic program. The way I'm a policy person, used to work in the US government. I now serve on the Defense Policy Board. I do not speak for the Pentagon in any way, so these views are my own, but it shows you how I approach artificial intelligence. I see it from a lens of how it might impact our national security. And really, when you look at what artificial intelligence is starting to already do, is it creates superpowers in the way it intersects with other technologies. So cyber, what Nate and others can talk about a lot, you are already seeing AI write malicious code. You're also seeing a lot of the cyber defense companies here in Silicon Valley and elsewhere really retooling themselves to be AI enabled, and you just don't know quite where that race is going to end up. On the bio and chem side, the new large language models, even the ones from 6 or 8 months ago, are already excellent scientists. And when you start working with plugins and more specifics, even more so. There's a famous experiment that you probably heard about. It's now old, over a year ago, in Switzerland, where they asked the AI to come up with new nerve agents, and it did very rapidly, 40,000 of them. So that is going to keep going and becoming more difficult. Those of us who work in the nuclear weapons space, there's a lot of conversation on the policy side around whether artificial intelligence will upend strategic deterrence in nuclear weapons. I have to tell you, I worry, we can talk about this a little bit more. I worry a little bit less about that piece of it because I think most governments, nuclear weapons are in the hands of governments, thank God. And most governments are so terrified about this possibility that they have a very clear human in the loop policy, including, by the way, I was just in China doing a track 2. It wasn't on AI, it was on other issues. I'm part of a separate track 2 with the Chinese on AI. And I think that piece of it scares everyone so much that no one's willing to touch it yet. But when you look at all of these intersections, I'm not going to talk about unmanned systems and drones because Jared will talk a lot about that. But that, of course, is a space of artificial intelligence where you're already seeing a huge uptick. You're seeing dogfights between drones on the battlefield in Ukraine. You're seeing drones being used all the time in the Israel-Hamas conflict. You're seeing targeting happening. You have some experiments where the AI pilots of jets are probably going to be more effective and faster acting than the human ones. And so at some point, there's a huge, in the commercial weaponry, there's a huge incentive to escalate and to let the AI do more and more and more of the fighting. And I think the US government is thinking it through very carefully. Almost a year ago now, a little more than a year ago, came from the State Department, but the Defense Department had a lot of input, created a voluntary set of commitments around military uses of AI. They're only voluntary, they're common sense, but I think something like 30 countries have now signed up to them. So that is kind of the direction in which this seems to be going and should be going. But boy, I worry a lot, and we'll talk about this in the second half of the program, that the regulation and the thought about how to thoughtfully control artificial intelligence is nowhere near keeping up with the speed of the technology. And I'll hold my remarks there. I'll say a little bit later about what regulation is already in place and what people are doing.
Well, I was going to ask you about that anyhow, so
okay, perfect.
Good, we'll get back to it. Okay, Jared.
Good evening, folks. I also will be giving Jared's opinion, not the US government's opinion tonight. When I think about the effect of artificial intelligence on the world I live in, as someone who has spent years of my life building artificial intelligence systems and then have now been around the Pentagon long enough to speak at least broken DoD, what I would tell you is that the shift over the last, say, half decade has very much been towards a world where the phrase great power competition is something that folks utter, and it's commonly, believed to be the case. And what I would say is, more broadly, what you certainly see is an increasing level of holistic geopolitical competition. And from an AI perspective, I would argue, or the way that I would frame this, is that what this class of systems allow us to do is to perform a variety of tasks with unprecedented speed, unprecedented scale, and unprecedented levels of performance, depending on what you're doing. And those realities have implications. Now, to be clear, they mess up a lot too. But those realities have implications for several categories that I care about and think about in the context of geopolitical competition. One of those is basic science and engineering. So some of what Anya was talking about, the ability to accelerate everything from interpretation of experimental data to synthetic computational design to running advanced simulators for design. You also have just a pure increase, I would argue, in economic productivity. So everything from search to code generation to image classification, but also things like interpreting clinical trial data, or something that David may talk about, which is being able to look at the entire Earth every day and glean information from that's useful. And the last bucket, in addition to your science piece and your economic productivity piece, is the efficacy of military systems. And there are a variety of ways in which AI can enhance the efficacy of various systems that one would use in a security context, ranging from intelligence to kind of more efficient healthcare for the entirety of the services, to a lot of different things. But I would also tell you that within that, kind of with that security lens on, there's actually competition across the entirety of the technical AI stack. And I'll break that down. I'll give you a teaser how I usually break that down. So I think about me as the user. I'm closest to the system. The part of the system that's closest to me is the user interface. So I interact with something and then something happens under the hood. There's usually software running under that, and there's software running an application. So that's bucket two. There's, in an AI system, there's generally an algorithm powering that piece of software. That algorithm is usually trained on and operating on data. And lastly, that algorithm is crunching that data on a piece of hardware, like a chip. And if you look across that stack, those 5 buckets, there's user interfaces and those things change here and there. Once you get to the software level, there's interesting competition across even the different software environments that folks use. So in the US and in a Western environment, you would see code that's written in TensorFlow or in PyTorch or these very large open source frameworks that are often maintained by billion-dollar companies, which is an interesting phenomenon. And on the other hand, though, what you see is the Chinese equivalent. One of them is called Paddle Paddle, which, if I poll a room, the number of folks who have heard of that is generally not very large. The user base is way smaller. And that's a competition issue from a workforce perspective. So if folks are learning to build machine learning systems using a particular type of system language, it actually creates the workforce that, say, Google and Facebook and these companies that maintain these frameworks use and that they need. And there's also an underlying kind of security question there, which is if you're having software that is running on top of libraries that are sourced from, say, Western companies, that's a different world than if most software is being built on top of a underlying library stack that's built off of libraries owned by state-owned enterprises from a security perspective. On the algorithmic piece, actually, a lot of the algorithms you'll find that even in the most advanced models today, they're often open source, which brings you to the data piece. If you read any of the kind of papers describing the latest awesome model, you'll find some interesting pieces about architecture, and then on the data, it'll say like a paragraph, particularly from the big companies, because that's the competitive advantage. And in a data piece, you end up seeing that countries are competing for access to data, illicitly and illicitly. And it is becoming a battlefield for kind of geopolitical competition. And then lastly, I don't really need to say much about the hardware piece, most likely, but there have been everything from export controls on particular classes of chips that allow you to build particular types of models, to attempts to restrict the movement of the lithography equipment used to make them, to massive amounts of money going in to indigenize chip production in a variety of countries around the world. And so what you see is, again, there's this lens of, how does AI affect the world that I live in? There's those 3 areas that that the functionality affects. But then when you kind of zero in on what does the tech stack look like, you actually see competition across every layer of that tech stack in a pretty interesting and different way. So happy to talk more about that later, but that's where I will turn it over to David.
That's great. Yeah, David, please.
Great. So Frank asked me to talk about implications for the environment and sustainability. And with any technology, there's both positive and negative outcomes. And I would say fundamentally, my biggest concern would be around just the functioning of societies. Any environment issue is basically a collective action problem. You need like well-functioning societies with good governance and political institutions. And if that crumbles, I don't think we have much hope for much, but especially for environment. So I'll get that out of the way. And then there's also the bioterrorism piece, which is huge in the world of food. And you're seeing that there's always risks, but you're seeing potential for great acceleration of those risks. And then we were alluding before, I mean, just the energy consumption of some of these technologies is really a non-trivial factor right now in terms of trying to get emissions of greenhouse gases peaking and going down. This is working against that. There's probably many other risks and negative things, but let me just talk a little bit about what I'm excited about. And as a researcher, I guess I don't have to spend my days worrying about the negative risks if I choose not to, and I can choose to focus on the positives. So I think there are some really exciting things going on. First and foremost, I think in terms of accelerating the innovation that we really have always relied on for environmental progress. In the space of food, for example, you're seeing the combination of AI and synthetic biology and gene editing. And these are really starting to produce much faster production cycles of both agricultural products like crops and new breeds of animals, but also like novel foods. One of the examples that we recently talked about in class was this company called Nopco, which is using AI to design plant-based substitutes for animal products. And their AI algorithm told them that you could really make a very good substitute for milk if you use pineapple and cabbage and a couple of other ingredients. And sure enough, that was one of the successes. I'm sure that they probably had a lot of failures.
Just don't try it in Florida.
Yeah. Right. You don't want to be taking certain medications probably. Anyhow, there's many other examples in the space of just of thinking about new products very quickly that can displace some of the more polluting products that we use, whether it's in the food space or otherwise. The other area or one of the other areas Jared alluded to is just our ability to track things around the world. And a lot of the environmental damage in the world is often illegal activity or activity that can't be traced very well. And so the supply chains really can't be sure where it's coming from. But you're seeing now, for example, with illegal fishing, there's very good ability with AI to understand which ships are actually illegally capturing, and you can trace that back to where they go. You're seeing with deforestation now, with the European rules coming into effect on trying to have deforestation-free supply chains, those types of things are becoming possible because of a lot of these AI technologies. So that's exciting. And then last, but certainly not least, I think is just the sort of autonomous management of production systems. A lot of the environmental costs, apart from the ones that are due to illegal activities, a lot of the environmental costs are just from inherent inefficiencies in the system. And a lot of that is just due to the difficulty of producing things at low cost for large scale consumption. A couple examples there would be in the US, we have typically sprayed fields or put fertilizer on fields well before planting, but generally doing things at very sort of homogeneous sort of treatments. Now with AI technologies mounted on tractors, you can basically be spraying individual plants or individual weeds with what you need to, and it's reducing by 90% or more the amount of chemicals being used. And those chemicals have huge environmental impacts. And it'll take a while for those things to work, not only to be adopted, but for the chemicals to sort of wash out of the system. But there's huge potential upside in that. And then similarly, like in China, I know they're using AI to build like super pig farms where they're all monitored very closely for diseases and for feed efficiencies, et cetera. And if you think about, say, pigs in China or any large country that's trying to really increase the efficiency, that has huge ramifications for global resource demand and environmental consequences. So I think there's clear, tangible progress being made with these technologies in the realm of the environment. And I think we can continue to build on that, but we'll probably get more into the risks as we get into the discussion. I think a lot of them are sort of direct risks, and a lot of them are sort of related risks as other parts of society start to be affected.
Good, thank you. Nate?
So I'll talk a little bit about AI and democracy. And let me start with like the meta comment here, which is AI amplifies the abilities of all good and bad actors in the system to achieve all the same goals they've always had, right? And so that's true if you are a foreign intelligence service that wants that previously had difficulty hiring English language speakers. Now you've got AI tools that'll help you, so you can, either whether through messaging or other tools, have an impact on another country. That's true if you're a challenger to an incumbent running for office, where previously you didn't have the ability to generate text or video or other kinds of things. It was much more difficult. I have a former student of mine who started a company, and and in some of my speeches, I put this up there. We've done AI jingles saying, vote for Nate or vote against Nate, right? And they're really good. They're compelling. And so from the democracy perspective, I think that it's important to understand that it's going to like a lot of the digital tools that we've experienced over the years, that this, is going to amplify the abilities of good and bad actors. Second point, though, is to say that AI is not social media, okay? Which is to say, all right, it interacts with social media, but we are taking to AI, I think, a frame that we've developed and kind of a cognitive map that was developed with respect to Facebook in the 2016 election, which I think is a mistake. AI is so much more pervasive and significant than any like given platform or given communication infrastructure. And so we need to be, I think, careful. Yes, it is true that there is an antitrust problem when it comes to AI. There is a privacy problem. There's a bias problem. There is obviously a disinformation problem. But they're characteristically different, I think, than the ones that we sort of brought to the fore when it came to social media. So if Kevin Roose of the New York Times is able to train ChatGPT to turn it into a kind of paranoid racist, that's a very different problem than if everyone's social media feed is getting they're getting fed that kind of content. One of the ways that AI is different than social media is the fact that there are open source tools. Now that is one of the drums that I keep trying to beat here at Stanford about why we need to think about this in a little bit of a different way, which is that it is not just a few companies that can be regulated on kind of closed systems. Now, the tools are in some ways very small d democratic in that they're going to be made available to all of us and are being made available to all of us. That's true, of course, with like Llama and Meta's open model. So they call them open sources, a bit of a misnomer. Models with open weights, as our friends at HAI would say. Mistral, the French government, right, produces its own open model. The UAE even has its open model called Falcon. And there are many others. In fact, on Hugging Face right now, if you go, you get, I've been told as of a few weeks ago, 60,000 versions of these open models at this point. Now, why is that significant? Again, why is it a little bit different than the way we thought about it in the kind of the world that was dominated by Google and Facebook? Is that now these tools are available to all of us. This train is leaving the station here. And so whether there are really good benefits to that, both from an antitrust perspective as well as a digital divide kind of perspective, that other, while the compute capacity is still concentrated in the West, and China, that then, there is the possibility that some of the benefits of AI could be realized more globally. But there's also, from the risk standpoint, there are, I think, really significant risks. And I'll just end with one example of what I think the chief risk has been in the year and a half since OpenAI released ChatGPT, which is that because of the open source tools, we've seen an explosion of child pornography on the internet. Now, this is an example to prove a point, not like that's the way we should think about AI as a child pornography generation tool. But the point is that because it's not the same kind of regulated industry phenomenon that we see in other tech incarnations, that it has essentially empowered the world to create content, and some of that content would be something like what we're seeing with child pornography. And there are knock-on effects, which this has totally destabilized the enforcement architecture that we've developed in the kind of legacy world to deal with that problem. So that is a kind of window into what the future holds, which is that the democratization of AI will lead to fundamental challenges to establish kind of legacy infrastructure for governance of, propagation of content or any other kind of thing that, well, it's not just related to content, but all kinds of structures that may have been in place when people didn't have those extraordinary abilities that AI is going to provide them.
Okay, thanks very much. So maybe to start off the conversation, what you just said, Nate, actually, I find a little surprising. Fei-Fei Li, one of the co-directors of HAI, wrote an article in The Atlantic a couple of months ago, saying basically that her lab at Stanford University could not remotely afford the kind of cutting edge machines that are used for building the large language models. And, training sets, I mean, there's a lot of things that really do reward scale. The fact that this is open source and other people can make use of these capabilities doesn't necessarily belie the fact that there really are economies of scale in this whole system. And so anyone that wants to comment on this is something obviously that people are worried about in the US, China, whether, these two countries are going to dominate, the AI race and the AI world, and disadvantage everybody that doesn't have, the ability to get either the hardware or the data on that scale. But any of you,
Look, can I just say one thing just to
Yeah.
be clear? I'm not saying that all of us are going to be able to build our own LLMs, right? But the point is that the LLMs that are being built and are provided open source are going to give us capabilities that we don't have presently.
yeah.
Do you want to jump in? Oh,
Sure.
tag team.
Sure. I can throw a couple of
point.
thoughts here. One is that there is a distinct difference in the style of hardware that you need, the magnitude of hardware you need for training versus inference, which is just running the model. And so, yes, from the standpoint of if I were to say, where is the capacity to train the biggest models today concentrated, it's certainly in the hands of some number of companies and some number of nation states. I think that's a true statement. Now, what you also see, though, is over time, this is the way that these things tend to work is that humans hit limits and they engineer around them. And so right now, the way that we're building these models is often we are scaling up something that scales up pretty well. Now, the minute that you start seeing regulations going in or that you start hitting technical barriers, folks are actually they're pretty good at engineering, and they'll find ways to accomplish a similar functionality with maybe a slightly different chip, maybe a slightly different model architecture, maybe instead of having to train something from scratch every time, starting from one of the open source models and just refining it a little bit. So what I would say is there's a big difference between being able to train something from scratch and then being able to, say, modify it slightly for your own use. And I think that is a much more distributed capability. Over time, though, but this is exactly also, though, why Feifei was arguing for kind of the National AI Research Resource in the US, because if you don't have folks outside of industry who are able to access that scale of compute, then yes, your kind of ability to continue to innovate, will almost by definition go down. And so this is that hardware access issue is an important one, but I also think that there's a really important aspect of this kind of closed source, open source thing that I would point out to folks is there's an absolute gap and there's a relative gap. And no matter what the relative gap is, and if you argue it's always there, so maybe you have some set of actors that has models that are slightly better than the open source, folks seem to really like continuing to release stuff in the open source. And if you think about it from an absolute perspective, the things I can do today using open source models versus 2 years ago are bonkers in terms of how different they are. And I expect that to continue. And so there will be a lot of things where I don't care that the open source version is slightly less good than what's in a company. It's good enough to do something that's fundamentally new. And I think that's the world that we have to adapt to your point.
Let me take that and add the geopolitical overlay, because I think you're exactly right, Jared and Nate. So yes, the best and most sophisticated foundation models are in the United States, and they require the most advanced chips, the NVIDIA chips, the AMD chips. And yes, the US is export controlling those, meaning that the Chinese are, depending on who you ask, 6 to 9 to 12 months behind with their biggest large language models. But almost everything we've talked about here, maybe not, I don't know about the Earth Systems models, but everything I've talked about in the national security space, you don't need the most advanced foundation model. So actually, you can't export control your way out of the concern that anybody who has access to Llama, which is anybody because it's open source, or the other open source models, or the 10 Chinese large language models that are maybe just a little bit behind ours, anything dangerous, and most of the positive things and most of the dangerous things we're talking about here can be done now. So that means, when we talk to the US government about this stuff, they're still very much in a control mindset because it's what governments are naturally better at. But I think in the end, we're going to have to adopt a negotiation and almost like an arms control approach to the national security side of this.
Okay, well, David, do you want to add to this?
Well, I agree with everything. I think a year and a half ago, or maybe a year ago, I think we were thinking, for example, universities couldn't possibly sort of stay up to speed with the industry because they're just so far. But nowadays, industry models get released, and within like a day, people have shown that you can sort of reproduce the performance with a much lower parameterization. And so I think everything they said is very much the accepted wisdom today in a way that it wasn't like a year or two ago. And what Jared said is, I think, absolutely true, which is that if you have 3 or 6 month old capabilities, they're still way beyond anything we could have done 5 years ago.
Okay. All right, so we've been dancing around the question of regulation. Actually, at the Cyber Policy Center, we had a presentation about the new European regs that were being put out, and it did strike me that the speaker couldn't actually identify what harms these regulations were actually trying to deal with. What can be regulated at this point? And does it make any sense to do this? Is it going to do more harm than good by simply deterring innovation? Or do we need to set the groundwork for a different kind of regulatory system in light of this?
I think that last point is key, is that we can all kind of throw words onto the page as to how like we might regulate AI, but the technology is moving so quickly. And frankly, the resources of states are so limited in this that it is very difficult right now, I think, to predict what kind of regulatory apparatus you're going to need going forward. And as an example of that, the first draft of the AI Act, the European AI Act, did not include generative AI, okay? It was mostly about facial recognition and a lot of the privacy violations and bias and things like that. Then ChatGPT blows up, and of course, they've got to go back to square one. And so now the European AI Act has kind of two kind of interesting features. It sort of looks at sectors and applications of AI, in particular settings like criminal justice, employment, education, as well as sort of loose regulations and disclosure obligations for the general purpose AI models, the ones that we're familiar with once they reach a certain level of power. I think that, I have no idea how the AI Act is going to be enforced, right, at this point. I think it's very difficult. There's so much that needs to be interpreted there. And what it requires is certain types of risk assessments. I mean, one of the things it requires certain types of risk assessments before the deployment of these models, all of which I think is good. And I think part of what we're going to need is a transparency regime, just so we can get some insight into what's happening in these models before they get released in a widespread way. Because it is very difficult at the front end to predict all of the risks and then to control the model. I was just on a panel at HAI just this week where I asked about the open source question, and they said, "Oh well, we shouldn't release it unless we're sure it's safe." But the point is, you're not going to know it's safe. The point we can't think ChatGPT, as I understand it,
well out of the bag.
One thing that when they released ChatGPT, they didn't realize it could be used for coding. This is what I'm told. Half the applications of ChatGPT right now are coding. Right? It's like that's a kind of big, surprise, right? And there are a series of things like that where you think the model is going to do one thing, and then some creative people use it to do other things. And so, what I would say is we need to build the infrastructure to have a kind of dialogic relationship with the companies so that we understand what the models are doing, and most importantly, to develop a kind of market for robust auditing systems. Because I don't really feel we're there yet. I think the Europeans hope that that's what's going to kind of organically develop. But I don't think we even really understand what a sophisticated, full-on AI audit of these systems would look like.
Yeah, and if I can just
let me maybe jump in and give you all the overview of what the regulatory space looks like from global to local, and I'll try to do it briefly. So this is going to be a patchwork. And that means there will be lots and lots of spaces in between. And right now, almost all of it's voluntary, except for the EU AI Act. So if you're starting global, the UN has actually a pretty good process on this. They just released some pretty vague principles because the larger you get, the more lowest common denominator it's going to be. But 120 countries signed on. Amandeep Singh, who runs that process, is a really good, thoughtful guy, but it'll continue to be voluntary and vague. The G7 has released principles, again, voluntary and vague. Then you get to the EU AI Act, probably the most specific and the only thing with regulatory teeth that Nate just described. It actually goes into effect, I think, next month. So we'll see how that goes.
Part of it. Like the frontier stuff doesn't a while, right?
Exactly. Then you have, I think, what has been the most innovative thing in all of this, which is the UK got out in front, and they had a big conference last year, the Bletchley Declaration, and they created an AI safety institute that's actually up and running. And as of last week, I think has tested 5 of the models and has come out with, hey, here are the harms. Again, the models, the companies give their models to the AI Safety Institute for testing voluntarily. Okay, but it's okay. It's better than nothing. I think they're going to open up something here. The US government has just started down this path. So under the Commerce Department, they've opened a very small office run by this very smart woman who has no funding and like no team. And so we're a little bit far behind. And now you get all the way to US regulation, where Chuck Schumer had this kind of listening session with the companies. They're starting to put pen to paper a little bit on some, what might be legislation, but I have a feeling we're going to run out of time, because in a month, you're going to be pure election. And so nothing really is coming out of that process yet. Then I will just tell you all the way to the local. I mean, here, you all are a part of these conversations. Many of you probably are. People are thinking creatively about this problem. And no solution has emerged yet, but I did hear one this week that some people are just working on pro bono that would essentially create a separate AI model that ingests the relevant rules and regulations. Like, let's say you're doing something in the bio space, it does everything around bio. And it becomes a supervisory model that intersects with the model you're trying to use. You could scale that up to all the laws and regulations in the United States, globally. It's the kind of the most creative idea I've heard on this. It's in its infancy. And I think the takeaway for all of you from what Nate said and what I'm saying is patchwork and mostly voluntary.
Okay.
Oh yeah, if I can jump in really quickly on 2 points. One is one that I will say is a challenge, and the other one is maybe a bit of a hopeful note on this. The challenge, I would argue, in almost all of these cases, whether it's regulation or if it's an arms control, is verification. That is the challenge here. In arms control, particularly in a nuclear context, I have verification regime. I can detect radiation. I can do if you want to tell me, hey, I'm only running this model version, whatever, on this piece of compute over here that I don't have access to. I mean, have fun doing that at scale. If they have the resources of a nation state that are not that big, that's hard. So thing one, that's an area that no matter if it's the political declaration, whether it's kind of voluntary commitments, whether it's proposed treaties, all of it runs into this verification problem. And if I were working on kind of AI and security things right now, that is a place that I would spend a lot of my time is thinking about verification. So that's thing one. Mm-hmm. Thing two is what the regulatory challenge that was just described sounds a lot like this in the abstract. It sounds like there's a technology we actually don't understand how it works all the time. We know it often does good things, but it can do some bad things too. We don't always know what the bad things are, and we don't know how often they happen, but we know they happen. But we think that actually on balance, a lot of these things are more good than bad. So we whether because we don't have a choice or because we think they're actually on balance good, we want to get them out there in society and in the economy. We actually, I would argue, have an agency that's pretty good at doing exactly that, which is the FDA. That is exactly what a drug is. It is a compound that, by the way, it's a fee-funded agency, so companies pay the FDA to go and take their submissions, and they hire experts, physicians, to do this. They look at the kind of data that's presented and say, okay, we acknowledge that you did these experiments. Here's you presented these risks. Go back and maybe do these other ones, and then we're going to release this thing, and we're going to have post-market surveillance on it. And if it starts acting weird, we're going to pull it. So I'm not saying that's exactly the structure, but I would argue that that has a lot of the outlines of what you would want here, and it's not a crazy thing from a regulatory perspective.
And I think what the UK AI Safety Institute is, it's a voluntary FDA for AI for whoever wants to submit. Yeah.
The key question, though, is do we have the capacity to pull back? That's why I emphasize the open models at the beginning, which is that once these things are out in the wild, it's much more difficult to control the ability to pull them back. Mm-hmm. And that, by the way, is the story with Stability and the child pornography explosion, which is that Stability had some stuff that was barriers that were in the model to prevent the development of child pornography, but because it's an open model, then you got unstable diffusion, which was then fine-tuned in order to create this, and we will never live in a world where that's not possible. And so then the question is, well, what other kinds of things are like that once the horse has left the barn, that then there's no way that we can get it back in.
David, okay. I'm just trying to imagine how the US government is going to handle any of this stuff because we've had this historical problem hiring, good talent in this area and keeping them happy and paid adequately and not subject to a gazillion, regulations. Nate, you and I talked about this, I think, at some conference a while ago. This stuff is moving so fast, you cannot, let Congress write detail or have the agencies write detailed rules about, in fact, the French
They've been at it for a year.
Yeah.
But nothing's happened.
The French regulation actually specified a number of, how many parameters, beyond which, you're going to, I mean, it's just crazy. That rule would be outdated, a week after it was stated. So I'm just trying to imagine what kind of a government do you need, even for the transparency stuff, to simply understand what these companies are doing. Seems to me we're very, very far from having that kind of capacity right now.
Well, that's why I think you need to conscript civil society and the market here, because you're not going to get the talent in government. I mean, when in the executive order, where one of the requirements is that every federal agency have an AI, chief of some kind, right? Isn't that what it's called?
No. I'm shaking my head because the point you're about to make.
Yeah. So it's like, great. Where are you going to find these people? And it's like I'm looking at these Stanford undergrads here, some who could probably play those roles. But it's like, all right, they're going to make a decision like $500,000 a year down, 2 blocks from here, or are they going to go in and work in these federal agencies? Now, you should work in those federal agencies, folks. If you're here, we need more of that talent in government, but it's going to be really, really difficult to get. So the point about transparency is not, so there's an enforcement side of that, which I think is important, but it's also about giving access to other people who are not tied to the profit maximizing mission of the firms, so that then they can do some kicking of the tires both before and after the models are released. And this is, as you mentioned in the intro, I mean, this is something I thought is good in the social media sphere as well. But all the more so here, because I don't think you're going to have the government capacity. You need to have academics and others, and we need to, lock it down to make sure that it's, that there's security in place and all of that. And I think, frankly, the AI companies are willing to go in that direction. I think that they just want some kind of direction here as to what they need to do in order to release these models.
I worry that maybe we were there 18 months ago, but now this has become an arms race, and the incentives are the incentives for the companies are to grade their own homework for as long as possible, just like they did on social media, which is, by the way, I think I only described it in one sentence, but this idea, it's not my idea. It came from Craig Mundy, who was former CTO of Microsoft, and some others, and it's in its infancy. But it's the most creative idea I've heard in a long time. And the idea is essentially you create a separate AI model that grades the homework. So it ingests all of the laws. It's not allowed to be creative or hallucinate. Maybe in addition to the laws, it does things like general ethics, fables, and it spits out, and then you intersect it with whatever your model is trying to do. And it says, I'm trying to create this new drug. That is illegal in the United States because it's a Schedule I controlled substance, and this one you cannot do. No, this one is possible, so you could do this, right? That's the kind of thing, and it's the first technical kind of supervisory tool I've heard of. And then if you had something like that actually worked from a technical perspective, you could intersect it with tort law. You're like, well, if you run it through the supervisor, then you're fine. That's considered not negligent, but otherwise you're liable. I don't know. We're a long way away. Okay. This is all theory.
I want to open this up to the floor, but I want to ask one question of David first. So you gave the most optimistic, future for
only because I knew they were going to be such downers. I had to pick the other side.
But I'm wondering whether there's a role for government here. I mean, we have an industrial policy now with regard to the hardware side, right? Is there like a coordination problem that exists in your world where the government could actually play a helpful role by supporting innovation, or is it just a matter of keeping hands off and letting the market, do its magic?
it's not an area I know a lot about. I would say letting the market do its magic for reasons that have already been discussed is not going to really work well. In the context of like in the context of the applications I think about in sustainability environment, I think there is a strong role for sort of multi-government coordination on all these things. And you're already seeing that with, for example, tariffs around carbon and supply chains, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So, I think very much like Anya was saying, I think the idea of using these tools as sort of a supervisor of the models could also be applied in this context of using these tools to help coordination and help monitor what's going on. I mean, in many ways, these companies seem to be using models to train their own models, right? Like, mm-hmm. And I think it's a similar experience there. So I don't have a great answer for you, but I think there's probably some role for that.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we open it up for questions, comments in the audience? Yeah, right there.
Danny, I'm a MIP alum. Anya, and maybe also the others, you mentioned competition between firms, and this may or may not be related to the regulation question. You also mentioned great power competition. Mm-hmm. So isn't the incentive, or how do we think about this? Because it would seem that maybe the incentive, rather than actually regulate anything, is to track as many resources in those directions, because we don't want anything to go wrong, but we also really, really don't want the other great power to win.
I mean, you said it. That is exactly what's happening. And I think that's why the all-out rush for the most effective large language models is on, and people are treading very gingerly around how to restrict, other than the EU, because surprise, none of their tech companies are leading in this anyway. I know you're Swiss, but, and the geopolitical competition gets super complicated because you have the US and China, and maybe there's a race on for technology. But in a lot of areas, we could actually collaborate. And by the way, we did until super recently. Like, all the big tech companies had huge AI research centers in China and vice versa. Then you look at kind of the middle powers that aren't clearly aligned with either the US, Europe on one side, or China on the other. And here, just wrote an article about this. You look at the Middle East, and the Saudis and the UAE really want to play a role in AI. They're throwing huge subsidies at this, both the technology, but also trying to do the data centers, low-cost electricity, everything that you were talking about, kind of the fifth part of your stack, the electricity, the chips, the data centers, the rails on which this is all going to be run. And they're saying, come train your models here. Now, that's great, except they're doing as much business with the Chinese as they are doing with the Europeans and the US. And so do you use that as a government to bring them, quote, on side with the West? Or do you say, no, we have to do all of the training and inference of these models at home? All of those questions are totally unresolved.
Can I say something about the political situation in Europe on this? It's kind of interesting because it's not following what I'll call the GDPR model, which was the old saw is America innovates and Europe regulates, right? And then Europe regulates for the world because they have the capacity to do so, and then they're a big enough market that they can make a difference. When it comes to what was the negotiations over the AI Act, there are some fissures in Europe, so that the Germans and the Italians and the French actually were not aligned with everybody else. And so part of the vagueness, I think, of what ended up coming out is both because of how difficult it is to write a law like this, but also that there are sincere differences in the EU. And there are, the French have some pretty good, at least on the expertise side, they've got some pretty sophisticated folks that are work there. And as it's been related to me, they've said, look, we missed out on the internet. We missed out on social media. Damn it, we're not going to miss out on AI.
And Macron literally said that.
Yeah. And so it's we shall see, right? It's still the case that our companies are the ones that are leading here, but I think the hope is with public, like with Mistral, the kind of public infrastructure that they're building, that then maybe they could be major players in it. But again, I have no idea how the AI Act is going to be implemented. And there's a lot of delegated acts that have to be to come out. We're producing in the Cyber Policy Center just a document that summarizes all of the AI regulation options that are out there that people have proposed, as well as the EU AI Act. It's written by Florence Giselle, who is the digital governance chair at Sciences Po. This is over 400 pages long right now, okay? And we don't know when we can be done. It's almost a conceptual problem. Like, how do you know when you're done with a report like this? Because there's something new every week that we're having to deal with. So.
And as a technical person, I'll make a very non-technical point here, which is there's a very interesting sociological aspect of this, which is if you believe that a lot of the geopolitical competition is going to happen in the commercial sector with like adoption of products and what systems underlie, which models are underlying big commercial products. It's really interesting because the level of openness in your society has an impact on the data that you're using to train. And so, if I'm being offered products from a country that basically uses whatever the heck that is on the internet versus one that maybe uses a subset of it that is governed by GDPR versus say one that is governed by a state-owned enterprise that that has a particular geopolitical bent, which of those things do I actually want running underneath the service that I'm offering? It's actually not obvious. And there are competitive implications to that reality. And so, for instance, I mean, I'll say this glibly, but the extreme version of this is kind of LLMs with Chinese characteristics, right? It's like they will say different things. You will get a different answer. And that has implications for what products you would build on top of it and their competitiveness in a global market, which with my, kind of live in the free world hat on, like I'm actually kind of a fan of that dynamic because I think that you win. And I think that this is one of those cases where openness actually is an advantage.
Yeah, go ahead, Gustavs.
Thanks. I want you to imagine a world where the AI models improve at a rate where, say, in the next 5 to 10 years, they are comparably central to geopolitics and the balance of power in the world as nuclear weapons. What do you think the interaction between the private sector and government looks like in that world?
It's a great theory, and it's already coming true. So, look, not to be too glib about it, but it's a little bit like a bunch of private sector entities invented nuclear power and nuclear weapons all at once. And it wasn't the Manhattan Project, and it wasn't contained. And so now you're dealing with a hugely powerful technology that's, I think you're going to see that. You saw kind of the excitement about it over the last 18 months. And now, I mean, I don't know if you all use it, but my kids certainly do. I certainly do. In the next 24 months, you're going to see everybody using it for everything. And you're going to see all of the positives and all the harms really come to the fore. And it is controlled by large corporations that are much harder to rein in because the genie's already out of the bottle.
Yes.
We're going to end with you on a positive note.
On a positive note.
I'm struggling now to come up with positives.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Nick. I'm
all the lawyers
alumni
always doom gloom.
I was actually, before I asked my question, I wanted to point out, you had talked about, I think Anya, you had talked about using LLMs as a sorry, the mic. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks. You talked about using LLMs as like a supervisory.
Actually, you should use the mic because we have
for the thing. You talked about
stream.
using LLMs as a supervisory layer. And actually, I run a machine learning platform for a pretty large company. It does a lot of scale. And we actually have tried that because we're pivoting very hard into Gen AI. And it's quite interesting. We've ended up having to spin up teams of humans to manage the LLMs. Because I kind of, even if you try to like fine tune this thing, it still doesn't work quite in the way that you want.
The supervisory model doesn't work.
No, the LLM. So what we've ended up doing is we kind of use a mixture. We've started training like much cheaper supervised learning models to do like, and so we just ended up with like a suite. And we've actually moved away from the generative AI like supervisory framework altogether. But it was a good starting point, and it kind of helped us build data to do training. But my actually my question was around I think David or Jared, you said this, the indigenization of resources. And I'm thinking specifically like Sam Altman putting out like a hypothetical $7 trillion raise to build, completely like build NVIDIA inside in-house. And I'm wondering if you guys could speak to that, what it looks like, because I don't, everyone says maybe data is the new oil, but chips are also seem to be like the new, basically like the currency. And I'm wondering what you guys think about that with respect to the private sector, but also how government gets in the middle of this. And then even just to throw like more salt, like Middle East money, it really worried me that it looked like a huge proportion of that debt, whether you get 700 billion or 1 trillion, looked to be like raised on a lot of Middle Eastern money. And what does that mean for us? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I can start briefly, which is this is a long conversation because what you're seeing is, for instance, you're seeing countries realize exactly what you just said, and you're seeing them act in different ways that align with their own comparative advantages. So you're starting to see, for instance, Japan go very, lean very forward on building data centers very rapidly and building chip production facilities for TSMC, actually. You're starting to see folks in India go and say, hey, we want to do packaging. We want to actually start doing trailing edge things with the eventually getting to leading edge things. You're starting to see, obviously, folks in the Middle East with basically making a play on energy, which is like, we can do cheap inference, so build stuff here. This is great, and we're happy to take U.S. technology. We're happy to take technology from other places, and so I think you see it, and then you even start to see folks like Southeast Asia, even Australia, starting to realize like upstream that actually means that there's some critical mineral supply chains that are also important to these production pieces, and you've got to get those from somewhere. And those supply chains may actually not be as global as they've always been. So there's kind of opportunities for more folks. So what you're starting to see is pretty much around the world, folks playing to their comparative advantage, whether it's data, whether it's minerals, whether it's efficient production capacity, for instance. So if you compare the rate at which the TSMC factory in Japan is being built with the one in Arizona, it's a very interesting case study, and like one being more rapid than the other. And so
much more rapid.
Yeah, so not to give you kind of a high level answer, but what you see is every country is looking at this situation that we've been discussing tonight, thinking about what are my comparative advantages, both technologically and geopolitically, and then moving out to capitalize on those as much as they can. And the way that you figure out what a country is doing is tend to like, what are their comparative advantages? That's what they're trading on. In some cases, it's data. In some cases, it's other things.
And the geopolitical overlay, you're right to point it out. It's what I was trying to say before, but probably didn't say it very clearly. You're right. Every country is scrambling to find out its competitive advantage, and each company is figuring out where it needs to get the different pieces. And 15 years ago, it would have been great. We're a globalized economy. May the best person win. Why don't we get the nickel from Indonesia? And who cares if it's a Chinese mine? Now everybody cares because the world on this high tech stuff is splitting in two. And what I was talking about with the Middle East is that there's certain middle powers that aren't clearly aligned with one side or the other. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes. I know our government is very thinking about this, but man, they got other things to worry about too. How much can it be open? How much does it need to be closed? How much do we need to lock up the entire value chain from the beginning to end? And it's unresolved.
And just on a very specific example, there is a very, very tangible. So if you look at the Chinese export controls on germanium and gallium, like it's, almost all the world refining capacity runs through there. So the minute that you start having export controls like that from a critical node in the supply chain, exactly what Anya said starts happening. People are like, okay, I can't guarantee I can get that anymore. The world looks totally different. The glass is shattered, and that's what you're seeing.
I'll say one thing about global public opinion on AI, which is that most of the world is more optimistic about AI than the US is. That we probably are the most anxious about the rollout of this technology, in part because, like I said, it's fit into a kind of techlash mentality that's been developing for the last decade or so. You see a majority of Americans right now are afraid that AI is going to determine the outcome of the 2024 election. I am actually personally, I think AI panic is its own democracy problem. The preoccupation with deep fakes and synthetic media and all that is actually leading people. The chief harm here is that people are going to stop trusting true media, which I think we're already kind of on the cusp of that. But it is a kind of interesting, as you look at what folks around the globe are thinking about AI, a lot of it is we don't want to be left out. And that this may be, if not a rising tide that lifts many boats, at least something that could have distributed benefits.
Okay, yes. Whoever had their hand up first, yeah. Okay, Sandy.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about the military applications of AI. And before I ask my question, there were two little pieces of context I wanted to give, which was that in 2020, the DoD issued their AI ethics. And of the five, number one was responsibility, that DoD personnel were responsible for the deployment and the use of AI and autonomous weapons. And the second tidbit was that in DoD Directive 3009, they specifically said that these autonomous weapon systems, if they are developed, need to have appropriate human judgment, not meaningful human control, but appropriate human judgment. So my question is whether you think the US should allow for autonomous systems to go through the kill chain on their own, to sense, make sense, target, and kill targets. And I have a hunch where the answer will be, so I'm curious what your risk tolerance would be if considered there was a conflict in the South China Sea and how that would change.
Mm-hmm. You want to go first?
Sure, I can start.
Be interesting.
Which is, at a high level, obviously the Pentagon says what it's going to say about those things. So that is well kind of out in the public record. What I will say is the following, is that there are various levels of automation that exist in systems that exist today. So if I told someone from 1920 that there was a missile that used kind of frame stabilization to guide itself, they would say, "Whoa, that's AI. Like that's crazy. Why would you do that?" And so there's, I think, a high level point here about technological tolerance and what folks are kind of what we're used to deploying versus technical capabilities, which to the points we were talking about earlier are just technology is moving very fast. So folks are trying to deal with this as it comes. But the second thing I would say is that, again, I'm going to make a high level point here. The way that you look at risk tolerance in any particularly security application, when there is risk, there is operational risk, is not what is perfect. What is the next best option? And there are absolutely times where, to give you an example, if you have a human and it is dark outside and they may be half concussed, they're not going to do a very good job of whatever they're doing. And so there are arguments to be made about, in an operational context, what is the next best option, and how do you provide, in a situation where you have responsibility for duty of care, where you have responsibility for, operations and activities that are dangerous. How do you make sure that when folks are choosing which risk to take, right? Because there's never an option that has no risk. So which risk to take, that when you develop systems that use increasing levels of automation, whatever it is, whether it's AI or frame stabilization, whatever it is, that you are being clear about what's the trade-off between risk and reward here? What are the risks I'm taking? How does that compare to the next best option? And why am I doing that? Now, is it possible that you have a bad outcome no matter what you choose? Yes. What I would argue is that the most important thing, and this is certainly what kind of folks in the security world think about, is how do you make sure that whatever system you're using, you have thought about those risks, you have done the harms analysis, and if you go and look at the DIU responsible AI guidelines, I helped write those for how we do acquisition programs in the DoD. So I've spent a lot of my time thinking about this. The question becomes, how do you communicate that? How do you assess that risk? How do you communicate that risk? And how do you make sure that the right person with the right equities and the right understanding of what those risks are is making that risk trade-off decision? Because so I think the most productive way to think about this question is exactly that. It's a question of what are the risks? How are we communicating them? And when folks are having to make decisions where either option has a risk, which ones are they making? And how do we continue to make sure that we're doing the right thing over time? At a high level, that is what you have to think about in these cases where there's often no answer that has no risk.
I agree with all that, and I would add 2 points. One, I have been so impressed at how thoughtful and detailed and methodical the U.S. Department of Defense has been on these ethical issues. 1. 2, this is totally theoretical right now. There's a drone war going on right now between Ukraine and Russia, including drones, dogfights with each other, jamming, counter jamming. You guys have all read the articles. And there is an increased on the battlefield. The incentives are always to allow more automation because it's faster and more effective and it gives you an advantage. So it's one thing to have these really, really good, really important guidelines. And then when you're in the heat of war and let's say a US aircraft carrier is suddenly sunk by a bunch of unmanned vehicles, sea and air, does it look totally different? So we are really in the beginning phases of all this. And I'm glad, sounds like you're writing about it and thinking about it. You seem to know a lot about this. That's great. We look forward to reading your stuff. The country needs you. Thanks.
Okay, we're near the end of our time. Was there one more question? Okay.
Yes, I'll take it.
Thank you, everybody. Sandeep, class of 2025, MIP Cyber. So I used to be an investigator at Meta, focused on elections. I worked on the 2020 election. Question comes up as you're all talking is we keep looking at this from the perspective of the suppliers, the actors developing AI, looking at it as an arms control and export control issue and a national security issue. But a question I wonder is the people most susceptible to the harms of AI, when we talk about misinformation, disinformation, even child safety, are people consuming the products of AI-generated content. Why do we never talk about this as an issue of development and poverty? And why, when we look at the US, we have 1.7 trillion in educational debt. We have multiple laws in multiple states undermining college students and education and actually disincentivizing a younger generation from pursuing higher education. An educated populace is least susceptible to disinformation, misinformation because of pre-bunking and just critical thinking taught. When we talk about these tools and this technology being developed as a risk to national security, why don't we also consider a lack of education or a susceptible population as a national security risk and make that a priority for being prepared both in developing a new generation of people to lead these AI safety offices and AI institutes, but also as people more vaccinated, I guess, against some of the harms that AI could develop. Thank you.
Well, so there's a lot of thinking about resilience, here, and this is not unique to the AI context. I personally think that we are overcorrecting on the information ecosystem issues with AI. I think that we are focusing on them because we've been thinking about them a lot in the tech space for the last 8 years, and that there are all these other issues that AI is, as Reid Hoffman says, a steam engine for the mind, right? Which is that it's going to allow you to do all kinds of things, and that we shouldn't kind of cage ourselves into the modalities of the past and focus on them. That's not to say there isn't going to be a truckload, millions of examples of shallow fakes, deep fakes, synthetic imagery. In fact, if you go on Twitch right now, you can watch a live debate, 24-hour-a-day debate between avatars of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Has anyone here done that? Well, if you're in my class, you've done this, right? It's something to behold. Now, it's kind of not safe for work because trolls are sort of throwing in all these obscene questions into it, but check it out and you'll see. And so the point is not on the production side. We're going to see all of that. And when I was just giving some talks in Asia, I had my AR avatar give some of this speech in Chinese, and then also because I was in Singapore in Tamil and in Malay, it's like, look what we can do, right? And so there's going to be lots of those things. But who am I as a professor to say no, let's not invest in education? I think it's important. Of course, we need more on that. AI literacy. People need to understand this. That's going to be challenging for a lot of reasons because it's not like there's a huge core of secondary school teachers who are experts on AI right now, except insofar as they're trying to prevent plagiarism in the classrooms. And so this is a real challenge. But what you're identifying is sort of a larger issue about building resilience. One thing I will say, and this is why I was saying I think AI panic is its own democracy problem. It's very difficult to build that resilience without also building widespread skepticism. And so if I tell you, be careful, here are all the tools I'm going to give you to be careful what's out there, be careful what you see. A lot of it's going to be fake, right? the truth is, even in the worst case scenario, a tiny, tiny share of what we experience online is going to be synthetically generated. But the doubt that is created by that tiny share then is going to bleed over onto the 99.9% that's true.
Okay. I want to thank everybody, but before we close the session, I'd like to invite our Associate Director, Chunira Aturapani, to close us down. Chunira.
I have the enviable role of expressing gratitude. So let me first start by thanking our panelists for their invaluable insights and their commitment to advancing global policy discourse. Please accept these gifts as a token of appreciation. It's not. Thank you. It's real. It's real. It's not plastic. Now it is AI generated.
AI generated font.
Yeah. Yeah. There's more. A few more. Yeah. We're gonna be back tomorrow. I also want to thank Frank for his dedication to fostering a stimulating learning environment and his exceptional leadership and guidance as director of MIP over the last 5 years. Yeah, we'll generate one for you, Frank.
All right.
I also want to thank all of you for your thought-provoking questions, your presence here today. It's really fantastic to see, students from the 2024 and the 2025 cohorts, alums who are spanning several decades, faculty, staff from FSI, our MIP team. It's really truly encapsulating an MIP community convening today. Finally, I want to thank the MIP team, Meva, Jonathan, Megan, Patrick, and Lale, for always demonstrating, the collective spirit of collaboration that has characterized the team and to helping to ensure a successful event today. I want to make special mention of Meva Richards, who is our Careers and Alumni Affairs Manager, who led the planning and execution of this event and whose vision, diligence, and efforts were instrumental in making this event possible and a success. So thank you, Meva. Thank you, MIP. Well, happily, the evening does not end here. We'd like to invite you all to a reception. It's in the Bechtel Courtyard, which is just through these doors. And to paraphrase Virginia Woolf, one cannot think well or sleep well if one has not dined well. So please do dine well. Thank you, everyone.
Wait. Before you go, this is the 20th anniversary of Chunira Aturapani's association with this program. So I don't want to do a long encomium, but Chunira is the most dedicated, the most skilled, the most compassionate person that could be, in a way, the soul of the program in terms of her relation to students, her teaching, her administration, holding everything together. So Chunira, thank you very, very much for everything you've done. Okay, so I think we can just go out these doors and there's food and drink. Okay, great. Thanks very much.